Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Shepard, and my guests today are Dr. Daniel Enemark, who designs experiments, and Rebecca Armstrong, Dr. Rebecca Armstrong, who is an educator. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about critical thinking, and as we all know, we have issues with logic in society. We tend to have things that seem to be a logical statement and things that are actually logical, and those don't always coincide. When people think they are being logical, what are they actually often doing? Daniel.
Oh. Well, I suppose it depends. I mean, sometimes they are being logical. Sometimes I have told you, if my child eats broccoli, let him go play in the yard, and he ate broccoli and you let him play in the yard. That is perfectly logical. The simple if-then statement, that sort of thing. But then sometimes you're giving your opinion on a political matter, or talking about which football team is the best, and you're being completely illogical, even though you may think that you've got all kinds of reasons to back it up. So it's an interesting question, but I think that context matters, right? So
Context does matter, but what I'm really getting at is when people often go through this thought process of thinking, oh well, if this then this, where they haven't really examined the logic behind their argument. They essentially have maybe three levels of things that fit together. Like, I wish I had an example right now. If you have an example, please jump in. But essentially, people think logically, like, well, A is greater than B, so B is greater than C, and if D is greater than C, then F must be the right answer, which actually has nothing to do with the first logical statements you made.
yeah, sure. So when people are not being logical, often what's going on is they're using. So logic has a set of rules, right? Like the rules of the road. And for example, one of them is, if you assume something is true, and you know that whenever that thing is true, then a second thing is true, then you can conclude that that second thing is true, right? So you could say, all people who have okay, so I'm trying to think
Let's
of
go to the football. Let's go to the football analogy. So you're like, well, my quarterback is the best quarterback in the NFL by the numbers, by his passer percentage. Therefore, I have the greatest football team in the NFL, which of course is not an actually logical. It's not actually true,
right,
necessarily, because a quarterback does not determine the best team.
So, right, in logic, there are two kinds of causes. There are sufficient causes, and there are necessary causes. A sufficient cause is something which, on its own, is enough to bring about an effect. So, for example,
let's come back.
If I pass air through my lips in just the right way, that is a sufficient cause for a whistling sound. Right?
Yes.
That is all I have to do in order to whistle, is to pass air through my lips with my lips in the right configuration. Right? That's all that has to happen. So it's a sufficient cause. Then there are also some things like necessary causes. So for example, if we just took that my lips are in the right position, that might be a necessary cause for me to whistle. or necessary condition for me to whistle, but it's not sufficient, right? Because I also have to blow air through my lips. So if I just go, no sound comes out, right? So that's a necessary condition,
but it's not a sufficient one to actually create.
And so if I say something, if I give some evidence for the truth of a proposition, so for example, I say, I have the best quarterback, therefore my team is the best team. Well, that piece of evidence is neither a sufficient condition for the proposition, nor is it a necessary condition. So you could have the best team in the NFL if you didn't have the best quarterback. For example, if you had a lousy quarterback, but you had an impenetrable defense, so that no team ever scored a goal against you.
And a decent running back. And just a decent running back. Your quarterback could not even throw the ball, and you win every game.
That's right. That's right. So clearly, having a great quarterback, is not a sufficient condition for having the best.
Right. Right.
It's also not a necessary condition, right? Because having a good quarterback does not guarantee that you have the best team, and having a good quarterback is not necessary for you to have a good team.
Right.
Now, it is a piece of evidence that might support the claim that you have the best team. One of a bunch of pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
But it is not alone sufficient or necessary. And so often we'll offer evidence that's not sufficient to support the proposition that we're concluding.
Right.
And that's when we're being logical.
Now, Rebecca, what are we doing when the average human being makes a decision? What are they really doing? Are they really thinking things through at all, or are they just basically making a gut instinct decision? Like, this is what I need to do.
Okay. Well, let's back up a little bit and just look at the word logic, because what Daniel has been describing are what are called the formal laws of logic, and they're based in a mathematical understanding that was discovered by the Greeks, that if certain things are assumed to be true and agreed to be true and certain conditions apply, then certain results must be true. And it's kind of a game, I want to say, and just put that, I'm not saying this is a judgment as good or bad. Logic is a formal game. It's got very specific rules. And like rules of the road, many people know about them. Very few people actually follow them, right? A stop sign is merely a suggestion for most people. Most people use the laws of logic the way they use traffic signs. They think they are being inside the law, but very rarely do people come to a full and proper stop the right number of yards away from a stop sign. I think this is also true in logic. People like to think they're logical for this reason. Our society privileges the mind and the logical mind as being something very desirous. Now, this is an interesting notion. Not all cultures privilege logic. Most people are not logical for the simple reason they're not capable of it because they don't actually understand the rules. If they did, they'd realize that it's almost impossible to follow those logical rules. Let me bring up an example that many of our viewers may be familiar with. The new television show out of England called Sherlock is hugely popular because Sherlock Holmes is designed to be a character who uses pure logic for his method operandi, which means that he suppresses what we consider to be our emotional sphere, the emotional realm of decision making. And it is a stark contrast to the way the other human beings behave. It's not always very pretty, and in fact it's considerably sociopathic in some instances to repress anything except pure logic.
And even Sherlock is not actually consistently logical. And in fact, one of the great misnomers in logic that I think is largely Sherlock's fault, and I mean the whole tradition of Sherlock, is this idea of let me deduce something, when in fact you are
it's induction. Yeah.
You know? So people say, I deduce that because you had red dirt on your shoe, that you must have been in the part of town where the dirt is red. You know, that's like a classic Sherlockian, I've deduced this, you know. But in fact, that's not at all deductive. It's actually inductive, which is sort of the opposite of deduction. And in fact, there are an infinite number of possible explanations for you having red dust on your shoes. Maybe you hired somebody to go over to that part of the town and rub your shoes in the dirt. Or maybe you found another place where there's red dirt. Or, you know, I mean, there's literally an infinite number of possibilities to explain that fact. And so you can't deduce that because this is true, this must be true. You can only say, because this is true, I think it's likely that this might be true. And that's induction, right? So, so your example is a great one, but even Sherlock it doesn't know the rules, or we should say Arthur Conan Doyle or the writers of the new BBC series, you know, they actually don't know the rules of logic.
Right. As most normal people in our population do not understand or apply the rules of logic. But let's look at it from a sort of social psychological point of view. We have these interesting rules. Why don't more people know them and apply them? And I would like to suggest it's because using legitimate logical thinking is, number one, arduous, and number two, it's not how humans are hardwired biologically. We don't only admit certain forms of evidence in this very formal kind of analysis. As human beings, we are hardwired to draw immediately all sorts of useful applications from our sensory data, from our gut instinct, and mostly, and most importantly, from our emotional realm. Most of what human beings do with their brain, I suggest, is make rationalizations, not use logic. Human beings are brilliant at rationalizing what they want to do because they feel they need their brain to concur, they need the superego to get the nod of consent, and so they manipulate the mind.
So in other words, they've already made their decision, and all they're doing is collecting evidence to support what they already believe.
Yes, to support, defend, define to somebody else, justify, you know, to rationalize is in effect to justify a decision that's already been arrived at by a completely different route.
Which is technically called confirmation bias, right?
Yeah, you know what you want to believe, and you're going to use the powers of your mind to convince other people that you're right.
I do think that sort of ego protection is part of what drives people not following the formal rules of logic. But I think actually something you hit on earlier is perhaps more directly the culprit, which is that following the rules of logic is arduous and is not evolutionarily adaptive. Because if somebody is running at you with a spear in hand, you know, it could be, there's a million things that could be true. You know, if we are only allowed to deduce, we really can't deduce anything. I mean, it could be true that he's really happy to see us and is running toward us and just forgot to put down his spear. Or it could be that he's doing that it's all an elaborate practical joke, or that this is part of a dance, or I mean, there are literally an infinite number of possible explanations for somebody running at you with a spear. But probably the most adaptive response would be for you to run away, or perhaps to brandish your own spear, right? If you wait until the facts are so conclusive that you can deduce, you know, because you say, well, earlier his friend said that he was going to kill me, and then later, you know, you get enough facts together that you are even close to being able to deduce that this is the case, you're dead long ago, right? And so, it's much more adaptive to engage in inductive reasoning, and to, as you say, to rationalize, to behave in a way that is based on reasons, which is what it means to be rational, right? not to behave in a way that is based on logical deductions, which
Right.
is what it would be to be logical.
So yeah, it is pro-survival then to do things that basically make snap judgments and back them up in a way that is promoting your survival.
To think probabilistically and not logically. And in fact, another great example of a cultural character who is sort of held up as a paragon of logic is Mr. Spock from Star Trek.
That's right.
Mr. Spock often says things like, it is logical that, and then he'll tell his conclusion. When in fact, every time he says that, it's actually not logical, it's probable. Right? So he'll say, here's some evidence, and therefore it's logical that here's my conclusion. When in fact, that evidence suggests that it is likely that his conclusion is correct, but it doesn't demand that it is logically supportable.
So
that's a wonderful example, Daniel, of bringing Dr. Spock in, and let's take Spock and Sherlock Holmes as cultural icons that have been held up as being logical archetypes and ask what is similar about them. And what's interesting to me is that both of them need to oppress their emotional side in order to be logical. But that's a curious assumption. In other words, I'm saying it's not logical to presume that being logical means you cannot also enjoy and make use of your emotional capabilities. And yet somehow in our society, we have deemed these two aspects of human nature to be at war with each other. That is a very curious social artifact, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So why do we have that perception? I mean, it's not just our culture. This perception goes back hundreds of years, and I think that human beings have this deep sensibility that somehow what we feel is at war with what we think. Now again, I don't think that this necessarily follows that to be emotional means you can't be logical or vice versa. But in our lived experience, there seems to be two directions that the human being wants to move. And the mind seems to be in control of one of those directions, and the body, with its emotional and physical hungers, appears to be in control of the other direction. Hence, we have this sense of conflict between the two. I think this is an artificial division, but it's one that we should look at, because we seem to be embroiled in heated conversations about this division.
Right. What is it that makes emotion, these instinctual responses, seem to be problematic or illogical to us? Why do we think that they're illogical? I suppose sometimes they seem to be. Sometimes our instincts seem to, oh my God, protect us, protect this situation. You know, get rid of those people, and then you talk to them later, and you find out, oh, that man with the spear, like, oh, he was actually trying to chase the guy behind you and save your life. He wasn't trying to kill you. Like, oh, I was such a fool to punch you in the gut. I thought you were trying to kill me. You know, so we shame ourselves for our instinctual responses, where really we should probably just assess what's really going on and continue to learn, continue to expand our perspective.
Yeah. Well, of course, the emotions, the gut reactions are for our survival. They are hardwired pieces of what we might call body wisdom or instinctual wisdom or even intuitive wisdom, if you want to use that expression. And they have been given to us as human beings to make use of so that we can move ourselves and our next generation into the future. But let's ask what it is that these higher functions of cognition are for in terms of human adaptation or movement into the future, because this is the more recent arrival on the scene of human beings on the planet. So let's ask, what is the purpose or function of logic? Why have we invented this arduous game with very tightly drawn rules? What is the purpose for it? And I'm going to toss the ball into Daniel's court, because I think that the arrival of science as a field in which these kinds of game rules have a wider berth is part of the answer to the question I just posed.
I just had a street sweeper passing by, and so I missed some of it.
Oh, okay. Well, Daniel, I'll just rephrase the question here.
You said, did you say that it's about the emergence of science?
Yes, that we worked out the rules of logic, and now we have a whole new domain with tools and structures and departments of individuals and various implements and gadgets, all of these now arrayed to be able to make use of these laws of logic that we invented.
Yeah, so first I think I would just return to Andrew's original question, which is about logic. When are people being logical? When people believe they're being logical, are they being logical? I think really the question is, when are people being rational? To be rational is to have reason, and it is to be agreeable to reason, and to have one's actions be based on reasons. And that's really our goal. Our goal is not to be logical, but to be rational. And in fact, even in science, science is not fundamentally logical, it's rational. And this is something that I think a lot of scientists would balk at that claim. It is fundamentally true that scientific explanations typically are not rationally deduced. They are not logically deduced. They are actually. So, for example,
we need to define logic now. We really need to define what is logic and why is it different from science.
Okay. Okay. So let's turn to the dictionary. Logic is the art of reasoning, and reasoning justly. Logic is the art of, let's see. Okay. Correct. So let's decide that we can determine our own definitions. Okay. And when we talk about logic, we're going to be talking strictly about the domain of formal logic, which is essentially a mathematical discipline that says if P then Q and P therefore Q.
So it's mathematical. It's essentially there are principles that if you've proven a principle, then that you have to rest on that principle and not violate that principle.
Right. And logic is designed to identify what can be with certainty known.
Ah, so essentially it's an abstract logical formula that is invented for each problem, for each experiment, for each logical experiment. You've invented your rules as you go.
Yeah.
Based on the principles of mathematics, which are, for all intent purposes, universal.
Right. So, modus ponendo ponens is a rule of logic that says if we assume two things: one, that P is true, and two, that if P then Q is true, then we can conclude that Q is true. Right? So if I say, if you died, then you must have been mortal, and I observed you die, then I can conclude with certainty that you are mortal. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You haven't died yet, Andrew, so maybe you are immortal. I can't conclude with certainty that you are immortal. It could be that you are a vampire and you will live forever. But I can use inductive logic to be fairly certain that you are not a vampire. Because I've never encountered a vampire, and because, you know, with a few possible exceptions, everyone who's ever lived has died.
So now you're talking about probability because we're talking about reality.
That's right.
Not abstract principles of logic.
Yeah.
Well, so, but I would like to break in here because I think, Daniel, that you've actually put your finger on the great vulnerability of what you're speaking about. Because, of course, the classic argument that is given to beginning philosophy students is assumption A, all men are mortal.
Right.
B, Socrates is a man. C, therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Right.
And they put that forth as this is your logical construct. However, if you are a very, very pious Christian and you believe that Jesus was both God and man and was immortal, you are not allowed to accept that first assumption. Everything hinges on whether or not you get buy-in to assumption A. And this constantly falls down into what I call an irrational assumption body. They make all sorts of assumptions which they believe to be true, but which are not, in fact, provable.
No, but that's fine.
There's no actual existence of energy outside of physical form, or there is no such thing as a sixth sense, and everybody knows that. Therefore, we can make that assumption. In other words, what you've decided to assume is already inside of a cultural, time-constrained box. And therefore, you set the rules of the game too small.
But that's totally fine within the domain of formal logic, right? Because
within the domain of formal logic, but people actually try then to argue rightness and completeness on the basis of these very fragile assumptions.
But I'd be really happy if somebody came to me and argued a case in a formal, logical manner, because that person would have to state all of his or her assumptions, and then build the case and say, you see, based on all of these assumptions and the rules of formal logic, and the rules of formal logic are fairly indisputable, right? They're very simple. I can draw these conclusions. Now, the great thing about an argument like that is that it makes the assumptions explicit, so that I can go and say, okay, I don't agree with this conclusion. Let me look at the premises, because if I agree with all the premises and I disagree with the conclusion, then perhaps I need to revise my own conclusion to accept this conclusion, because I agree with the premises and the rules of logic are indisputable. So,
right. But the problem with the premises is this, that a premise that is based not in an individual declaration, but in a culturally biased assumption is a very hard premise to recognize and stand outside of. And let me give you a very specific example, which has had huge consequences, which has been the treatment of women in most of the Western religious traditions for several thousand years. The problem there was that they had accepted an assumption based in cultural bias, which said that women are not the equal of men. They then rationalized this cultural assumption much later in the game by having Thomas Aquinas, quote unquote, reason his way back to the great philosopher Aristotle, who mistakenly assumed that all human fetuses are originally male and that woman is therefore, quote, a misbegotten male and hence lesser than her male counterpart. Now, in fact, this is actually the opposite of what happens. in the development of the embryo fetus. All right? In fact, all fetuses have the feminine qualities before they differentiate into their other qualities. But because of this misapprehension of fact, the cultural assumption that woman is a misbegotten male became the premise upon which all sorts of indisputable conclusions were then drawn about the role of women in society and the church. So
that's not a problem with logic. That's a problem with the premises.
Right.
No, but it's also a problem of logic, because when you are embedded in your cultural ethos and you have not the ability to stand outside your culture, all of these premises, which are assumed to be true because they're so obvious to everybody, then become not part of a game of logic, but a very dark kind of prison. And so you're locked into these conclusions because you don't have the tools to question the assumptions that have been laid down by your society.
But if we didn't have the rules of logic, wouldn't we still have these pernicious cultural assumptions? I mean, I don't.
We would.
Logic.
We would, but too often logic is used to rationalize cultural assumptions. This is the main point I want to make. That logic has now been used as a tool of cultural oppression to rationalize the assumptions which become unassailable because everybody must know that, blah, blah, blah. And this is where they become dangerous.
Yeah, but I mean, you could say the same thing that, oxygen fuels fire, and many people have been killed in fires, therefore let's get rid of oxygen. I think, sure, logic is used to justify based on false premises, conclusions, but that's not to say that logic is a bad thing.
No, nobody's trying to tear down logic itself.
Logic is all tools can be used for good or for ill.
Hmm?
It's just
all tools can be used for good or for ill.
Right.
And in the wrong hands, logic can be a tool of oppression or destruction.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so can anything. Right.
Indeed.
But I think what we're really saying is that under the auspices of the purity of logic, we have perpetrated great rationalizations and assumptions that do not fit to get what we want, what essentially an elite minority or a majority wants to have.
Yeah, but if you set up any set of rules for how to justify conclusions, people who have evil intent will use those rules to justify their conclusions. There are people who use, religious scripture to justify things that are wildly incompatible with the teachings of the people who wrote those religious scriptures. Right. But because where conclusions must be justified by religious scripture, they twist and pervert that scripture in order to justify the conclusions. And there are people who live in cultures where, there are people who live in contexts where some other rule of justification is relied upon. Like, for example, an appeal to authority. And you say, well, whatever Jerry thinks is true must be true. And so, okay, I believe this is true. And by the way, Jerry agrees with me. So, let's go kill this person because Jerry said so. No matter what the rule is for how to justify conclusions, people with evil intents will try to abuse that rule in order to justify their own.
But it doesn't even have to be evil intent. I would suggest that one of our cultural assumptions, that would be premise A, is any and every individual is entitled to the fruits of his or her labor. I believe that this is something that most Americans would agree is true, that we accept this to be true, that this is how our society is constructed, that anyone who works hard is entitled to the fruits of his or her labor. However, the consequences of that belief are becoming more and more obvious in that the fruits of some individual's labor is so immense that if they actually took everything that they were quote-unquote entitled to under the basis of this belief, they would leave no fruit for anyone else on the tree. Now, in some cultures, that premise would be looked at and be laughed at. No individual is entitled to the fruit of his or her labor. Your tribe is entitled to the fruits of your labor. You're not working for yourself. You know, what kind of bizarre, selfish mentality is that? So we are then at odds with other cultural norms by this very specific belief that, again, most people would say that seems true to me. We talk of taxation as a necessary evil. You know,
Yep.
I mean, that's another conclusion from that premise, that to be taxed is somehow not, it doesn't feel good, it's not right. I should be able to hold on to everything that I earn. So these premises can have very deleterious consequences that we then try to rationalize by going back to our original assumption.
Yeah, but again, I think your complaint is about premises, not about logic.
Sure.
If we fix the premises, then logic will lead us to the right conclusion.
But what are the new scientific tools that would allow us to press people upon the examination of the accepted premises? I say that there are not enough mechanisms in place to press people to actually question the premises that they are using for most of their experimentation.
Do you mean among lay people or among scientists?
I would say scientists too, lay people certainly, but I think even among scientists there are certain kinds of groupthink premises which remain unquestioned.
Yeah, absolutely, and even there are certain conclusions that are so ensconced in the sort of power structures in science, i.e., that there are certain conclusions that enough of the people who control the scientific journals believe that they won't let dissenting viewpoints into. So
Right. The practice of throwing out the outliers in any statistical survey is one of those curious phenomenons, which begs the question of what assumption are you working on? Why are some of your results considered so far off the charts that they literally should be left off the chart?
Yeah. Nothing should be left off the chart, but sometimes, sometimes something is such an outlier that we know it must not be true. For example, if we asked a group of people in a census, how much money do you make, and one of the people said, I make $1 quadrillion, then, or we look through the data and it says that one of the people made $1 quadrillion, I'd say, well, it looks like somebody put in too many zeros when they filled out the form, or that this person was pulling our chain, or something, this is going on here, but we know that nobody makes that much money, because if someone made that much money, the effect on the economy would be so profound that everyone would be aware of it, right? And so there are times when we can get rid of outliers because we know that they really don't belong in the data, but we need to address that, right? So if we do that, then we need to either have a footnote somewhere, or just say, listen, we had some cases that were way out there, and for this reason or that reason, we don't include them in the analysis, and here's the effect if we were to include them.
Right. Or inadvertently in this survey, Bill Gates sent in one of the surveys, and it skewed our results.
Right. An unlucky draw. Yeah.
But if that's true data, then that anomaly, that outlier piece of data is actually factual evidence, and you have to well, actually that's something to be considered in the whole data set, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, but if you had a sample of 20 people, and you because you had a small research budget, and you did a sample of 20 people to try to figure out how the economy is doing, and you accidentally, in that sample of 20 people, one of the people was Bill Gates. So, okay, let's not pay too much attention to the mean here, because it's going to be really drawn to the right by
By one.
Okay, so maybe we should, look at the median instead.
Depends what you're trying to find, what you're trying to assess with the experiment, obviously. Now, Daniel, I want to just ask a question here about, we've sort of defined logic as this math, and nobody's going to disagree with math itself.
Right.
Define logic as these rules that you build. You start with some assumptions, and then you build logical arguments, and then you don't break the rules. But in the scientific world, in this reality, when you're trying to apply logic to it, I mean, is there anything true? Is there anything we can actually assume fundamentally about reality at all?
That's a big question, Andrew. A lot of people would disagree on what the answer is. I think it's maybe more of a question for a philosophy professor, which I am not.
What can science prove?
Okay, that's a question that I can probably answer a little bit better. Science doesn't really prove anything, and I don't want people to think, oh, here's somebody who doesn't believe in science. I'm a huge believer in science. Science certainly supports many very useful models for understanding the universe that we live in. It is not a system in which we prove things logically. So, for example, Newton, the children's story about an apple falling on Newton's head, and then gravity. The thing about gravity is that it's very compelling because it explains so many naturally occurring phenomena. So if you take Newton's laws and you apply them on Earth, you can explain why it is that an apple falls from a tree. And if you apply it to the cosmos, you can understand why it is that the moon revolves around the Earth and the Earth revolves around the sun and all of that. Right? And so you can explain a lot with gravity. Now, as it turns out, Newton's theory of gravity was wrong because he believed that bodies were acting upon each other at a distance instantaneously. So, this body, if it's massive, affects this body immediately, when in fact, gravity only works at the speed of light, which is what Einstein found. And so, for example, if God were to pluck the sun out of existence right now, we would continue to rotate around its center of gravity until the period of time that it takes for light to reach the Earth, which I think is like 8 minutes or something. Or maybe more, I don't know. But the important point is, Newton's law of gravity is not true. It's not exactly true. It's an extremely useful model, though. And so you can't prove that something is true in science. You can just support the claim. So what you do is you create a model of the universe or of whatever system you're interested in, and then you take that model, which is a theoretical model, which is itself logical, which starts with premises and through the rules of logic arrives at conclusions. And then you take that theory and you deduce some hypotheses from it. And the hypotheses are predictions about observable phenomena. And those hypotheses have to be disprovable. And then you undertake an empirical investigation to find out if those hypotheses are true. And if they are true, it supports your theory because it shows that the universe behaves in a way that is consistent with your theory. It doesn't prove your theory because it just shows that the universe behaves in a way that's consistent with your theory. But in fact, there are literally an infinite number of other possible theories that could explain the same information in a different way. So,
and because scientists have recently looked into the deep darkness of space with their telescopes and decided that it looks like something like dark matter may exist, and therefore 95% of the universe may be unobservable. it makes it very highly probable that there is something else affecting the conditions that we believe so strongly are just the way we see them to be.
Yeah, sure. And I think, let's think of a good example. So I might have a theory that is mass attracts mass, and that's basically, Newton's approach to gravity was that massive objects attract each other instantaneously, and that's why the apple falls. Well, long before Newton, the Greeks had a theory about why some objects fell and some objects rose, which had to do with the fact that different objects are composed of different essential elements, and that some essential elements were higher in some sort of metaphysical sense almost than others, and the higher substances rose and the lower substances fell. And that theory may have done a good job of explaining the world around us. You could also come up with a theory that God simply decides every object whether it will fall or rise, and that if I pick up my iPad and I drop it, God may decide that it's just going to go up this time. But every time, just every single time we let go of something, God makes a decision, and it just so happens that a lot of the objects that we've dropped fall on the ground, and that is consistent with the theory of gravity, but actually that's not what's happening at all, right? So, another, maybe even a better example would be the heliocentric theory of the solar system. So we're saying, does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the Earth? Now, it turns out that the Ptolemaic system, which was Earth-centric, actually did a better job of describing the location of the stars than did the heliocentric theory. So when Galileo was being harassed about his theory, it had less empirical predictive content than the Ptolemaic system, because the Ptolemaic system was so sophisticated and nuanced that people had said, okay, well, here's what happens. These celestial bodies revolve in perfect circles, but you know what? It turns out that when we look at where they are in the sky, it looks like they're not revolving in perfect circles. So, but we can fix that problem by saying that they have perfect circle epicycles, so that they go in circles within circles. And then we say, oh, well, actually, it looks like our data is still off. So maybe there's epicycles within epicycles within epicycles. And so they came up with such a detailed theory of the celestial bodies that actually their theory did a better job of predicting observed reality than did the heliocentric theory of the cosmos. But the heliocentric theory was much more elegant, right? It just said, well, actually, we could just solve all these problems if we said that the sun was in the middle. And so that's why we really care about how, in science, we often refer to this as how parsimonious a theory is. That's a big word that really just means how sort of efficient is the theory, how many conclusions can you draw from a small number of premises. And with the Ptolemaic system, you had to start with a massive number of premises to get to conclusions.
Wow. So what I'm understanding is basically science is a great method of creating models to explain things.
Right.
And you have to gather data and be willing to gather data that doesn't support your model.
Right.
Wherever the data is coming from, you use it until your model either collapses or it proves to be a useful model for generations.
That's right. And just because the whole search in science is for disconfirming evidence, and what you're doing is you're coming up with a theory, and then deriving from that logically deductive theory a set of predictions about the universe, and then you test those predictions to see if they're true. Now, if your theory generates a bunch of predictions that are all true, then you might say, I've got a lot of reasons to believe in this theory because it's helped me predict the solar eclipse and where to find Saturn in the sky and all of these sorts of things. But that doesn't mean that it must be true. It just means that it is consistent with a lot of observed facts.
Right.
So logically, it's not deductive at all, right? We're not saying that because Saturn was there and because the solar eclipse was on Tuesday, therefore it must be the case. You know, it's not true that it must be the case. It's simply true that this theory is consistent with the observed facts.
Right. So now, is this what human beings are capable of doing in their own lives? Is actually just committing temporarily to a model, a somewhat logical, but not necessarily formal logic, but a somewhat logical model of induction in which we're like, okay, I believe that this is how things work, therefore I'm going to add this evidence. Rebecca, what do you think? How are human beings applying science in their lives, if at all? And you know, is it working? Or are they comfortable having that model and having the dispassionate skepticism towards their model that scientists generally want you to have?
Let's start with a very poignant, small, but important illustration from the time of Galileo, since Daniel has invoked the great Galileo. Galileo had trotted off to Rome with his most powerful telescope to date in order to show it to the Pope and the various bishops and cardinals. And there was one bishop who soundly refused to look through the telescope for this reason: I already know what the cosmos is because I have been told by the good book. I don't need to look. Galileo, of course, was rather distressed by this response to his fancy new tool, and when he wrote to his daughter about this incident, she was struck with terror because she saw the writing on the wall. And in fact, as we know from history, that bishop's point of view turned out to be the prevailing idea, that Galileo's fun new tools of science were going to be too much provocation for the prevailing worldview, which is, we don't need no stinking science to tell us what's out in the cosmos. We've got the Holy Scriptures. My contention is that most human beings are still inside the mindset of that dear bishop. Most human beings do not want to look into the telescope. All right? It's the same situation in that great story of The Matrix, the film The Matrix, where he's offered the chance, take the red pill or the blue pill. Most people don't want to take the pill that says, would you like to observe reality without the lens of the social matrix in between you and what's real? Would you like to observe for yourself and draw your own conclusions? Most people in their heart of hearts would say, actually, no. I would much prefer to remain within the comfort zone of what is known to be certain and true, because I like feeling certainty. I don't think most people are hardwired with the kind of courageous stance that it would actually take to be more scientific, logical, or rational in their thought processes. Because the minute you say, yes, I'll look through the telescope, you are opening yourself to the possibility of immense disruption of every preconceived assumption and idea that you have, and the necessity of making choices, some of which will probably be difficult and throw your life into more chaos. So I think that we are still, and perhaps it's always been true, that there are the bishops willing to look in the telescope and there are those who are not, and that most humans do not want to look in the telescope.
Now this is interesting because in my youth, I had a great zealous craving for certainty, and I often would grab some new piece of data and go like, that's it, I've got it, that's the key to it all, and this is exactly the way it is, and I'm sticking my pins into the ground, that's where I'm going to plant my perspective, and that's where it's going to stay. Then the next day, I'd get a new piece of information which would completely rip that to shreds. And I'm like, oh, it's like the pain of losing that certainty was so uncomfortable. But it happened constantly throughout high school. It just kept on happening until I gave up on pinning my paradigm into the ground. I realized that I needed essentially to have an ever-changing paradigm that was not pinned, that could be like a floating vehicle, like a celestial body, where I kept expanding it and putting new pieces into it as they came up. And it was very uncomfortable to start that model. But I find it a much more adaptable model than any model that requires pinning it into the ground and it cannot move.
Mm-hmm.
I don't.
It's
are you saying that most people are not comfortable doing this? This is obviously it was uncomfortable for me to start this process, and it still is uncomfortable when any major shift happens to the model. But are you saying that people really just aren't built for this? They really, in general, are going to resist any kind of adaptable model?
I think all you have to do is look at societies, and you will see very quickly that the great majority of people must be buying in to the status quo, because there is such a thing as a status quo. If most of the people were thinking outside of the box, there wouldn't be a box. So the outliers are always going to be in the minority. There are more people willing to subscribe to what has been handed to them as a cultural premise than there are people willing to risk the pain and discomfort of pushing against the status quo to ask novel questions that go so far as to question the very basic assumptions upon which cultural prestige and position is based. Most Americans are living in a global totem pole in which they are pretty near the top. To question assumptions like everyone is entitled to the fruits of their labor is to, in fact, disrupt the capitalist system in such a way that we may find that we can't hang on to the really egregious amount of riches that we have taken for our own use, leaving so much of the rest of our global community without enough to sustain themselves. But to question that premise is a very dangerous thing. And so all sorts of safeguards have been put into place in our society to make sure that we don't question that, because it would bring a lot of things toppling down.
As a student of political economy, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that wealth around the world is a pie that one takes slices of, and that the United States has somehow taken a larger slice and left less for the rest of the world. I think that disparities in wealth have a lot to do with quality of governance and, you know, historical development. And it's true that the West has taken a lot from what we would call the developing world in the form of, you know, hundreds of years of colonialism and imperialism and all that stuff. But it is also not the case that day to day, you know, I'm not sure that, you know, because the size of the pie changes constantly. I don't think.
Well,
I think
but as a political economist, Daniel, you would certainly agree that the current, we're not even talking historical colonialism, the current practice of charging great amounts of interest to make loans to third world countries is exploitative and does impoverish them at our benefit. So what I'm saying is that the ability to do that is still based on the cultural assumption that we're smart enough to have invented an economic system where we have the capital to loan to these needy economies.
Well,
and we have the right to charge them interest so that they're constantly impoverished and in hock to us.
Yeah, but it may be the case that even giving money away for free is bad for people in economies like that, because much of the money gets filtered through a corrupt political system, right? So
absolutely, I would certainly.
It's not like if we could get rid of interest, our problems would be solved.
No, but to question the assumptions behind the implementing of that financial world banking game on the rest of the global economy is something that I think we should be asking ourselves. Why did we feel we had a right to dictate the terms of a global economy? When we set the rules that in fact would exploit what we were better at, right? Because we had the banks, we had the history of understanding how banking works and how loans work. So we've already stacked the deck in our favor and have justified doing so using all sorts of cunning rationalizations, which brings us back to the beginning of our conversation about how human beings can misuse the tools of reason to shore themselves up.
Right.
We want more.
I'm definitely not.
A way to do it.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to engage in a defense of the Western world with respect to the developing world in terms of the history of our interactions with them. Yeah, yeah, clearly there's been a lot of evil in our historical and even in our current practices toward economies that are poorer than ours. I just wanted to say that the model of how much of a slice of the pie are we taking, I think, is an oversimplification.
Mm-hmm. Right, but then the question should be asked, how is it that so many, and let's assume for the moment, and I believe this to be a true premise, most people want to be good. Most people want to be fair, because fairness seems to be something that's hardwired in the psyches with cultural variations, but most people want to be right and good and fair and just. They like the way things look when things are fair. So the fact that we have a grossly unfair division right now in the global sphere, somewhere along the line, those people who implement the policies based on social justifications that use argument, rational argument, to bolster themselves, somewhere along the line, those people needed to have asked a different set of questions about their use of rational argument. And this is where my problem with the current scientific paradigm lies. I'm not saying that logic is wrong. I'm saying that as a tool, it has been used inappropriately by people who were not willing to question the assumptions that then proved to be strong enough arguments that you could create systems of power which have disempowered so many people.
I think you and I agree that individuals and also political and economic leaders need to investigate their premises more thoroughly.
But
I don't think it's the problem of logic. I think it's the problem of premises.
Right.
Yes.
But here's the problem.
How do we get?
Here's the problem, guys. The problem with leaders questioning their own premises is that nobody gets to be a leader by questioning their own premises. I know that's a very black blanket statement, but generally, alpha males are rewarded for having a vision and sticking to it and being unrelenting and unquestioning of their own viewpoint, and actually, pushing people away who do question their viewpoints. I mean, that sort of leadership is almost a cult tribal model that has worked historically for a lot of people.
Let's not leave out the alpha females. I think Mark Thatcher would be unfairly disqualified from this conversation.
Yes, but like that control freak type of insistence has been a psychologically, evolutionarily successful archetype, and that questioning it has been historically not done so much, and yet we're basically saying we're getting into complicated times where questioning that may be what we actually need to be doing. Better leaders are coming about who actually question their own premises. Yes?
Who are those people?
Who are those people?
I'd like to vote for them.
I think we just lost Rebecca. I'd love to see them. I'd love to see some people who are great leaders questioning their own premises.
I've not yet encountered those people.
It's not common at this point. But that's why we're talking about this, because we want to promote this. We want to promote this adding this better system of I'm just going to invite Rebecca back to the conversation. I've got another question for you, Daniel. Can you give me an example of how, in politics, basically, people are so easily manipulated? In politics, people tend to essentially lead people down a logical line of thinking, and then ultimately they give them some sort of sales pitch at the end, and people go, "Wow, that totally made sense." But it didn't. I mean, this big question of how people are manipulated. I think if people understood how they are being manipulated by the auspices of logic, the auspices of rational theory, but actually they're getting a bait and switch, I think people would be a little keener, and basically it would help people in general to not be so gullible, to not be so easily manipulated by those leaders that are very good at pretending to be rational and actually slipping in this conclusion of their own design that doesn't necessarily warrant the evidence.
Well, it's very easy to convince people of things that they want to believe already, or that they do believe already. And one thing that we all would like to believe is that the successes we've experienced in life are our own doing, and that the failures that we've experienced are the doing of some bastards. and that's what a politician is going to sell you, is the idea that, you're doing great, you're wonderful, there's nothing wrong with you. It's that, the government is taxing away too much of your income, or the government isn't providing you with the opportunity that you deserve, or, the government is ruining healthcare by getting involved, or the government is ruining healthcare by not providing, your basic rights as a human being, which is to be healthy and to be provided for and not to be bankrupted by hospitals or something like that. So all of political rhetoric is based on the idea that you are awesome and the other people are bastards. And I'm on your side. I'm on the side of the awesome people against the bastards. So that's a pretty easy sell, I think, because you're just convincing people of things that they already want to believe.
Now, historically, the churches and temples were providing the alternative viewpoint, which was calling people to a if I can use this word, a higher realm of thinking about themselves, which was that I may be a marvelous person in the eyes of my government, but in God's eyes, I seem to be lacking a few of the necessary virtues. What can I do toward my fellow human being to improve myself? So I think that society was able to negotiate between these extremes because you had another social institution encouraging people to live up into their more, shall we say, self-sacrificial values, looking out for one another, being charitable, being hospitable, being generous with the almsgiving or the charity or what have you. I think that if religion gives up its traditional role and instead goes for the New Age feel-good, we have lost one of the most important players in this game, and there's very little then to prevent people from using their wits to simply back up and rationalize their own selfishness and desire to feel good.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. So, how do we take this forward? How do we actually encourage people to go against their instinctual, self-preservational desires, to actually question their own perspectives, and actually listen to differing perspectives, to people who don't seem to agree with them at all? How do we encourage people to actually try that that lens on and see if they can make sense of these disparate viewpoints?
Well, it's a beautiful question, of course, and one answer is to try to create situations early in the lives of young people where they are brought together with people of vastly different perspectives and worldviews. So they realize that these friendships can be built that do not require a set of shared cultural assumptions. They are introduced to worldviews that are vastly different and can see, wow, that also works. That is also a valuable way of becoming a human being. And, of course, to fill them not just with the immediate gratification of worldly goods and sensate activities, but to fill their heads with music and story and mythology and religious tales, or just, tales of any sort, that fill their heads also with these notions of the self that I might become, that also participates in these higher realms, where curiosity and honor and sacrifice for the good of another, these are also worthy ambitions. And it's not just getting the corner office or getting the girl that's the prettiest in the class. That's not the limit and extent of what I can see for myself. But I see myself as a global citizen.
Daniel?
I agree with what Rebecca said. I think that that moral teaching within families and maybe within communities, whether that includes churches or just larger communities of friends, or whether that's informal or formal, and to a much lesser degree, I think there's an ability to teach that in schools. But I think generally, if it's not supported within one's chosen community, as opposed to one's conscripted community, like school is. I think it's going to make a much more profound impact coming from a chosen community. But encouraging people to be moral people and to be loving people, and part of that is just confronting the fact that you're not always right. And I think that coming from a world of coming from the academic world, there's one way in which academics do really well with this, and there's one way in which they do really poorly. And the way in which they do really well is that they are open to discovery and to an ethical perspective of, we need to honestly seek out to see whether our preconceptions are true. And part of that is the thrill of discovery, and I think that when people discover the thrill of discovery, they're willing to give up some of the comfort of the security of believing that everything they already know is true, because they're willing to give that up in exchange for some of the delight of discovering something that you didn't already know, and in fact that maybe nobody knew. So I think that's where the academic world does really well, because they really believe in trying to discover new things and letting go of preconceived notions. Yeah. I think where the academic world does poorly is that people tend to believe that they're right about everything, and when people have been elevated to a position of respect through intellect, they start to think that they know everything. A good example of this would be the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, who did make significant contributions to the field of economics. I think a lot of his contributions were actually made by Brian Arthur, but anyway, he did make some serious contributions to the field of economics. But then he decided that he knew a lot about everything, and he only knows a lot about some things, and so now he he's just a left-wing political hack for the whatever New York Times or something. There are a lot of examples of people like this who decide because they know, or another great example is Dawkins, who's just has made some significant contributions to the field of biology and is a complete idiot when it comes to religion and all of that. So you read his books and he has like my 3-year-old. I know 3-year-olds who have a deeper understanding of Christian theology than Richard Dawkins does, and so he's sort of saying, "Oh, this made-up theology that I think other people believe in is false," and it's like, yeah, nobody believed that theology to begin with. So I mean, there are people who just decide because I know a lot about biology, I know a lot about everything, and because I know a lot about economics, I know a lot about everything, and so when people get too connected to their sense of identity coming from being the smartest person in the room or the most knowledgeable person in the room, they start to be less open to disconfirming evidence.
It seemed that
and this is very amusing in that all three of us have been spouting off as if we really knew a lot and could give people valuable information.
Oh,
and
no.
We are now suggesting that humility is the great missing virtue in our field. And
I am the wisest man in Athens because I'm the only one who knows how little he knows.
And it is interesting
the beginning of wisdom is knowing how foolish you are.
It's interesting how we assign expertness, because you can only an expert can assign expertness to anybody. So it's essentially like the crown, the crown of knighthood or kingship to assign expertise. But basically nowadays, if you claim to be an expert loudly enough, then you are one.
And if you can get 1,000 people to agree, you've got yourself a YouTube channel.
There we go. Here we are. So thank you to my guests for joining me. We will be experts together in this current model of thinking, which someday will be debunked. Hopefully soon.
Well, but we are each in our own way an expert on what it is to be a human being.
And that is true. So thank you so much, both of you, for this lovely discussion on logic and rationality and critical thinking. And I hope to speak with you both again soon.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.